I do not belong here. Look at me. Someone with my skin tone, my profound lack of melanin, has no business living in the valley of the sun. Only SPF 70 can keep me alive in this cloudless place. And I knew you all got me when one of the first gifts you gave me and my family was a bottle of SPF 70 and a bottle of aloe for when I got the inevitable sunburn. And yet, a little over 5 years ago, my family and I loaded up all of our belongings and drove for the better part of 3 days to pursue the call to new ministry and adventure and greater opportunity. We drove into and through new landscapes. We passed over mountains, drove along rivers and across plains that seemed to stretch on forever. At the end of a 3-day journey marked by 2 separate flat U-Haul tire incidents, hours spent waiting on the repair person to arrive, we found safe harbor in Phoenix. Hospitality, welcome, people who were excited for us to arrive. Migrating is a basic part of being human. We move, as my family and I did, for work, to take better care of our families. Sometimes we move simply because we want a change of scenery, and we can. And at a more fundamental level, even if we live and die in the same town we were born in, we change over the course of our lives. We learn new things, we try on new identities, always moving, always evolving. What we need on these wild journeys of ours is not really all that complicated. We need companions on the path, hospitality at the end of the trail and all along the way. We need these especially when our journeys get tough. As the choir asked us in their song this morning, so I ask again, when the chips are down, when our neighbors are in need of shelter and safety, whom will we harbor? Today we kick off a month in which we'll explore the theme of hospitality. This theme is vitally important for a few reasons. One is found in Valley UU Congregation's end statements, basically a statement of the big goals of our ministry together. We've set as one of our goals to offer radical hospitality. We'll come to see in future weeks that term has a long, rich history in progressive religion. But one of the implications of that term is its call to extend hospitality beyond what hospitality is traditionally understood to mean, to make it active rather than passive. Growing up in the Midwest, hospitality meant always being willing to offer a meal to anyone who showed up at the door. Mostly families showed up, of course, and one of the first questions both my grandmas would ask when someone came by was, "Are you hungry? Have you eaten?" Then they would run down the list of things they either had ready in the kitchen or could whip up if the guests could stay long enough. There's leftover meatloaf, we have chicken, there's chocolate pie, we have lunch meat if you just want a sandwich. Saying you're not hungry will not stop the litany of food available. Only agreeing to eat something will move the conversation along. And that is a beautiful tradition. I'm proud of it, and I hope I can carry it on in a worthy manner a manner worthy of my family's kindnesses to me and to their neighbors. But radical hospitality calls us to offer of ourselves and our possessions to those who may never show up at our door. Sometimes to people who are in imminent danger, who have traveled a long time to arrive here, seeking the same things we all want: safety, opportunity. Radical hospitality asks us, whom will we harbor? In 1939, the story that has become more well-known, I think, in the past few years, 937 people set sail on a ship called the St. Louis from Hamburg, Germany. They were headed to Cuba, almost all of them Jews escaping the Nazis. Most of them had applied for U.S. visas, so they planned to stay in Cuba long enough for the paperwork to go through. Then they would move to the USA, land of welcome and opportunity. When Cubans caught wind of the ship headed for their shores, newspapers began calling for the government not to accept the refugees. It seems the Great Depression had contributed to a scarcity mentality in Cuba. Why should they allow more immigrants in to take jobs that rightly belong to the Cuban people? Why should the Cuban people's resources be spent, even temporarily, harboring refugees from another country? There were anti-Jewish demonstrations in Havana attended by as many as 50,000 people, calling the Jews communists, demanding that they be driven away. The Cuban government ended up admitting about 30 people. Most of those 30 had valid U.S. visas. Their paperwork was already finished. One person tried to commit suicide and was admitted to a Cuban hospital. But the other 900 plus passengers were not even permitted to leave the ship. As it sat in dock, U.S. newspapers began to pick up on the plight of the St. Louis. Then it set sail again, heading back east. The Holocaust Encyclopedia, which is a project of the U.S. Holocaust Museum, records what happens next. Here's what they say. Sailing so close to Florida that they could see the lights of Miami, some passengers on the St. Louis cabled President Franklin D. Roosevelt asking for refuge. Roosevelt never responded. The State Department and the White House had decided not to take extraordinary measures to permit the refugees to enter the United States. The State Department telegram sent to a passenger stated that passengers must, quote, await their turns on the waiting list and qualify for and obtain immigration visas before they may be admissible into the United States, end quote. U.S. diplomats in Havana intervened once more with the Cuban government to admit the passengers on a humanitarian basis, but without success. So having been turned away from the United States, the ship headed back to Europe, where various countries split up the passengers. Belgium took 214. France took 224 temporarily. Of the people on the ship, 254 died at the hands of the Nazis. 254 human beings perished at the hands of the Nazis in large part because the United States did nothing to help. The similarities to the current day are sobering. Just a couple weeks ago, U.S. Attorney General Jeff Sessions' lied and editorial, and said that DACA, the bill which allows young people brought here by their parents to stay and work in the U.S., had led to an uptick in accompanied minors crossing our border, though they wouldn't qualify for the DACA program. There was indeed an uptick fueled by gang violence in their home countries, violence to which some are all too happy to return people. Immigrants are still portrayed as dangerous interlopers rather than suffering siblings. Our nation's track record on harboring our fellow human beings, even when they're in imminent danger, is shameful. Just as in 1939, some say the law must be followed. There are quotas, there are limits. They say that immigrants would take American jobs. Some say that people must go back to their home countries and get in a 10 or 15-year line. We seem to be waiting for a golden age to offer harbor. We seem to think that there will eventually come a time when conditions are perfect, and then we can welcome people from war-torn and violent countries whose lives are in danger. Until then, here in the days just after Judaism's high holy days, it seems to me our Jewish neighbors have yet another lesson to teach us. Treatment of immigrants is a central theme in most of the world's great religious traditions, actually, and that certainly includes Judaism. The founding story of the faith, in fact, is a story of immigration. God calls Abram and says, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you." Later, Abram hears that there's opportunity in Egypt, so he takes his family, and as the New Revised Standard Translation states it, Abram went down to Egypt to reside there as an alien, for the famine was severe in the land. A few generations later, again driven by famine and lack of opportunity, Joseph and his family moved back from their homeland to Egypt and were welcomed there by Pharaoh. But over time, the Israelite population grew in Egypt to the point that Pharaoh was afraid they would become a powerful voting bloc, say, or overtake the country some other way. So he started talking about illegal aliens and a land of laws or something like that. And when the Egyptian people were sufficiently fearful, he made the Israelites slaves. Until, of course, God heard their cries and led them out of Egypt to freedom of a sort, wandering in the desert. The Israelites became nomads, from then on hardly ever having a land of their own. It seems to have colored the way they treated immigrants going forward. A few quotes from the Hebrew Bible on that subject from Numbers. You shall have one statute for both the resident alien and the native. In Joshua, God tells Moses to give cities of refuge to the Levites. From Deuteronomy, quote, for the Lord your God loves the strangers, providing them food and clothing. You shall also love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. And again, you shall not withhold the wages of the poor and needy laborers, whether other Israelites or aliens who reside in the land. It seems there was some question in Ezekiel's day whether immigrants should be afforded all the benefits of citizenship. One imagines public education and driver's licenses might have come up. Ezekiel said, the aliens shall be to you as citizens, and shall also be allotted an inheritance. And then this upstart Jewish sect comes along that goes off the rails and comes to be called Christianity. It carried forward, I can say that because my heritage is Christian. It carried forward all those teachings on hospitality. In fact, when its founder, Jesus, was just a baby, the story in the Gospel of Matthew is that his family went on the lam running for a ruler who was trying to kill them. They found harbor in a faraway land. One of Christianity's most important figures, the Apostle Paul, wrote in his letter to the early Roman Christians that the mark of a true Christian was the extension of hospitality to strangers. In his letter to a small early church, the author of the first epistle of John said that God is love, and the only way people could tell God if God was present was if people were loving one another. And at the very end of the Christian Bible, in the book of Revelation, the end of times is described, though it is grossly and sadly misunderstood. The book pictures a new Jerusalem coming down to earth from heaven. The New Jerusalem is a great city, vast and wealthy, which welcomes people from all over the world. And in a symbol of hospitality and shalom, the gates of that city are never closed for fear or safety. They're always open, always receiving immigrants entering and leaving. There is, in Judaism and Christianity, the traditions that give birth to our tradition, a resounding call to systemic and individual welcoming of the immigrant, to hospitality to those who would cross our borders. Now, I know that you and I, sitting here today, can't fix our country's long broken policies on immigration. Though some of the passages I just mentioned were intended to be followed as laws thousands of years ago, and it's frustrating to see the backwards progress we sometimes make. Though our goal may well be for our nation to be more gracious and welcoming, getting there is a long haul. But as we drive that path, we can make ourselves the living embodiment of safe harbor in our own lives. I think we can do at least two things to make it so. First, we can be mindful to take the time to listen to a person in need. I know that doesn't sound like much, but undivided time and attention are a priceless gift. More than needing to be fixed, often when we're struggling, what we really need is a companion. Sometimes a mostly quiet companion who can simply bear witness to our struggle. It takes some work to get ourselves ready to do that kind of listening, since we're used to constantly communicating with words. But when we quiet our spirits enough to really listen to someone who's suffering, we offer harbor and perhaps learn ways in which more full harbor can be offered. And second, I think we should educate ourselves and call on our leaders to temper law with compassion. The same way the ancient Israelites did, we can be a voice in our nation for moving past our fears of scarcity and into a trust in the plenty and abundance of the world. There is enough to go around. A trust that allows us to more fully offer harbor. Someday, we may face the questions the song asked us earlier. Would you harbor a Christian, a Muslim, a Jew, a heretic, convict, or spy? Would you harbor an exile or a refugee, a person living with AIDS? These bear reflection. But the song has two more questions for us, and they serve us well in all times. Would you harbor me? Would I harbor you? Eventually, that's what it all comes down to. Amen.